The morning sun filtered through the large windows of the Southern Pearl, casting warm rays across the polished hardwood floors. In the bustling kitchen, Michelle Anderson stood quietly observing her staff as they prepared for another busy day. The air was rich with the aroma of freshly baked cornbread and simmering gumbo, a recipe passed down from her grandmother. At 32, Michelle had transformed what was once a run-down building into one of Atlanta's most talked-about restaurants, but few knew she was the owner. She preferred to work alongside her team, often throwing on a server's apron during busy hours. It wasn't about hiding her success, it was about staying connected to every aspect of her business. Ms. Anderson called out Tom, her head chef, holding up a spoon of sauce. "I think we've perfected that new honey glaze recipe you were working on." Michelle tasted it and smiled warmly. "Just like my grandma used to make. The lunch crowd is going to love this." She checked her watch. 10:45 a.m. They'd be opening in 15 minutes. Walking through her restaurant, she straightened a few table settings and adjusted some fresh flowers. The walls were adorned with black and white photographs showing the history of the neighborhood, including one of her grandmother's old diner from the 1960s. Each table was set with crisp white linens and polished silverware, reflecting her commitment to excellence without pretension. The morning staff meeting was her favorite part of the day. Michelle gathered her team in the dining area, their faces bright with anticipation. "Remember everyone," she said, her voice filled with genuine care. "We're not just serving food here. We're creating memories. Every guest who walks through that door is part of our extended family." Lisa, one of the newer waitresses, raised her hand. "But what about those difficult customers?" she asked nervously. "You know, the ones who—" Michelle knew exactly what Lisa meant. Even in 2025, they'd occasionally dealt with customers who brought their prejudices to the table. "We treat them with the same respect and professionalism as anyone else," Michelle replied firmly. "Our success is the best response to their assumptions." As she helped the staff with final preparations, Michelle reflected on her journey. 10 years ago, she was working 3 jobs to save money for this dream. Banks had turned her down, claiming a restaurant in this location would never succeed. But she had persisted, drawing strength from her grandmother's words. "Baby, the only limits that matter are the ones you accept." The Southern Pearl wasn't just a restaurant, it was a testament to determination. Michelle had handpicked every recipe, trained every staff member, and personally welcomed countless guests. Her regulars loved how she would sometimes serve their tables herself, sharing stories about the dish's origins or asking about their families. The kitchen radio played soft jazz as the staff moved through their pre-opening routine. Michelle tied her apron, smoothed her hair, and checked her appearance in the reflection of a polished serving tray. She looked every bit the professional server, which was exactly how she wanted it. "Door opens in 5, called out Robert, the maitre d'." The staff hurried to their positions, adjusting uniforms and sharing encouraging smiles. Michelle felt that familiar flutter of excitement in her stomach. It was the same feeling she'd had on opening day, a mixture of anticipation and joy. Each day brought new opportunities to prove that success had nothing to do with other people's expectations and everything to do with one's own determination. Standing by the kitchen door, she watched as Robert unlocked the front entrance. The morning sun caught the restaurant sign, making the gold lettering sparkle. Below it, in smaller text, were the words that made her proudest: "Family owned since 2015. Little did she know that today would test everything she believed in about dignity, success, and the power of rising above prejudice. But for now, Michelle Anderson just smiled, ready to greet her first customers with the same warmth and professionalism that had made the Southern Pearl a local treasure. The lunch rush was in full swing when a sleek black Mercedes pulled up outside the Southern Pearl. Robert, watching from his position near the entrance, immediately recognized William Preston I from his frequent appearances in local business magazines. The real estate mogul was known for his multi-million-dollar deals and his less-than-pleasant reputation. Preston stepped out of his car, adjusting his perfectly tailored suit. Behind him, 3 business associates emerged, their expressions already showing hints of apology for what they knew might come. They'd been in enough business lunches with Preston to anticipate his behavior. "Well," Preston announced loudly as he entered, not bothering to wait for Robert to greet them, This place certainly looks different from what I expected. His eyes swept across the dining room with the kind of look usually reserved for examining property he planned to demolish. Robert maintained his professional composure. "Welcome to the Southern Pearl, gentlemen. We have your table ready. Please follow me." As they walked through the restaurant, Preston made sure his voice carried. "You know, I almost didn't bring us here, but my secretary insisted this place has become quite popular." He chuckled, the sound lacking any real warmth. "Though I can't imagine why. It's rather simple, isn't it?" His associates exchanged uncomfortable glances. One of them, a newer partner named David Chen, tried to redirect the conversation. "Actually, I've heard their food is exceptional. The reviews are outstanding." Preston waved his hand dismissively. "Reviews can be bought, David. You should know that by now." He pulled out his chair without waiting for Robert's assistance, the legs scraping against the hardwood floor. At a nearby table, regular customers who had been enjoying their meal paused their conversation, recognizing the kind of scene that was about to unfold. They'd seen entitled customers before, but Preston seemed determined to set a new standard. Michelle, who had been helping in the kitchen, noticed the shift in atmosphere. Through the kitchen window, she could see Preston's table and the way he was already rearranging the place settings to his liking, dismissing the careful presentation her staff had prepared. "I'll take that table," she told Lisa, who had been assigned to the section. The young waitress looked relieved. "Are you sure?" she whispered. Michelle nodded, straightening her apron. "Some people need a special kind of service," she said with a knowing smile. As Michelle approached the table, Preston was in the middle of explaining to his associates why the lighting fixtures were obviously cheap imports. He barely glanced at her as she arrived, his eyes fixed on his phone. "Good afternoon, gentlemen. Welcome to the Southern Pearl. I'm Michelle, and I'll be taking care of you today." Her voice was warm and professional, carrying the natural confidence of someone who knew their worth. Preston finally looked up, his expression shifting from disinterest to something more condescending. "Well, Michelle," he drew out her name as if it amused him, "I suppose you can start by telling us what makes this place so special. My associates seem to think it's worth my valuable time." Michelle's smile never wavered. "Our specialties today include a honey-glazed pork tenderloin with roasted root vegetables and our award-winning shrimp and grits. Each recipe has been perfected over generations." "Generations?" Preston interrupted, smirking at his associates. "How quaint. Tell me, where did you learn about fine dining?" "The local diner." David Chen shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "William, maybe we should look at the menu." No, I'm genuinely curious," Preston continued, his voice dripping with fake sincerity. "I'd always find it interesting how places like this try to compete with real restaurants." Michelle calmly pulled out her order pad. "Our chef trained at the Culinary Institute of America, sir, and our wine list has won regional awards. Would you like to hear about our wine pairings?" Preston's expression soared slightly at her composed response. He clearly expected her to be rattled. "I seriously doubt anything on your wine list would meet my standards, but by all means, enlighten us." As Michelle began describing their carefully curated wine selection, she could feel the other diners watching. Many were regulars who knew exactly who she was. A few had their phones discreetly out, perhaps sensing that this interaction would be worth documenting. The other business associates tried to appear absorbed in their menus, clearly embarrassed by Preston's behavior. But Preston seemed to feed off the tension he was creating, his comments becoming increasingly pointed. Little did he know that his attempt to assert superiority was about to backfire spectacularly. Michelle continued her impeccable service, each polite response laying the groundwork for what would soon become one of the most talked-about lunch services in the Southern Pearl's history. The tension in the dining room continued to build as Michelle handled Preston's table with unwavering professionalism. She stood patiently, order pad in hand, as Preston made a show of questioning every ingredient in the menu items. "And this gumbo," he drawled, tapping the menu with his manicured finger, "I assume it's some kind of home cooking." The way he said home cooking made it sound like a criticism rather than the point of pride it actually was. "Our gumbo recipe has been featured in Southern Living magazine," Michelle replied calmly. "Each batch takes 6 hours to prepare, and we make it fresh daily." Her voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who knew the true value of what they were offering. David Chen, trying to ease the situation, quickly spoke up. "That sounds wonderful. I'll have the gumbo to start." He offered Michelle an apologetic smile, which she acknowledged with a subtle nod. Preston wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair, studying Michelle with the same calculating look he used when evaluating properties for acquisition. "You know," he said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "I own several high-end restaurants across the city. Real establishments with properly trained staff." He emphasized the word properly while giving Michelle a pointed look. The other diners in the restaurant had grown quieter, many unable to hide their interest in the unfolding scene. Regular customers exchanged knowing glances, some shaking their heads at Preston's behavior. Tom, watching from the kitchen window, gripped his spatula a little tighter. "That's wonderful, sir," Michelle responded, her voice steady. "The Atlanta restaurant scene is quite diverse. Each establishment brings its own unique value to the community." Preston's eyes narrowed at her composed response. "Unique value?" He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Tell me, how long have you been waiting tables? Surely you must have bigger aspirations." The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy with condescension. David Chen suddenly became very interested in his water glass, while the other associates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Michelle smiled, the kind of smile that could light up a room, or in this case, quietly challenge an assumption. "I believe every role in the restaurant industry has its dignity, sir. From the dishwasher to the owner. Would you like to hear about our specials?" "I suppose you'll have to do," Preston sighed dramatically. "Though I must say, the service standards here are, well, let's just say they're exactly what I expected." He turned to his associates. "This is why proper training is so important in the hospitality industry." A young couple at the next table, who had been celebrating their anniversary, couldn't hide their frowns. The husband started to say something, but his wife gently touched his arm, nodding toward Michelle's calm demeanor. Michelle continued her explanation of the daily specials, her voice clear and professional. She described each dish with the expertise of someone who knew not just the ingredients, but the story behind every recipe. When Preston interrupted with another snide comment about simple food, she simply paused and continued when he finished. "And for your wine selection today," she added, "our sommelier would be happy to suggest pairings that complement each course." She knew their wine cellar could rival any restaurant in the city. She had personally curated it over the years. "A sommelier? Here?" Preston laughed out loud. "Now that's ambitious. Let me guess, someone who took a weekend course." He looked around at his associates, expecting them to join in his amusement, but they were too busy studying their menus with unusual intensity. Robert, watching from his post at the front, felt his jaw tighten. He'd seen Michelle build this restaurant from nothing, studying wine for years, earning her certifications, and personally selecting every bottle in their cellar. The sommelier comment hit particularly close to home. She had earned that certification through years of dedicated study. Michelle's response was measured, her voice carrying just a hint of steel beneath its professional courtesy. "Actually, sir, our wine program has received recognition from Wine Spectator magazine. Would you like to see our reserve list?" The mention of Wine Spectator caused Preston to pause momentarily. It was clear he hadn't expected that level of credentials. But he quickly recovered, waving his hand dismissively. "Just bring us a bottle of whatever you consider your best red. Though I doubt it'll meet my standards." As Michelle turned to fetch the wine, she caught sight of her grandmother's photograph on the wall. The strong, proud woman in the image seemed to give her a knowing wink. Little did Preston know, but his wine selection would come from a cellar that Michelle had spent years building, each bottle chosen with the same care and expertise he so casually dismissed. The stage was set for what would become a memorable lesson in humility, though Preston didn't realize it yet. Behind her professional smile, Michelle knew that sometimes the best response to prejudice was simply letting someone's assumptions unravel on their own. The first course arrived at Preston's table, each plate a masterpiece of presentation. Michelle placed the gumbo in front of David Chen with practiced grace, the rich aroma drawing appreciative glances from nearby tables. The steam carried the scent of perfectly simmered seafood and dark roux, a recipe that had won multiple local awards. Preston examined his appetizer as if he were inspecting a property for code violations. He picked up his spoon, held it to the light, and frowned. "I see spots on this silverware," he announced loudly. "Is this what passes for clean in this establishment?" Michelle picked up the perfectly polished spoon and replaced it with another, her movements smooth and unhurried. "My apologies, sir. Here's a fresh one." "Well," Preston continued, stirring his soup without tasting it, "I suppose this is what happens when you don't invest in proper kitchen equipment. I bet you don't even have a commercial-grade dishwasher." The restaurant's actual kitchen boasted top-of-the-line equipment that Michelle had carefully selected and purchased over the years. Tom, watching from the kitchen, had to suppress a laugh. He'd worked in some of the city's finest restaurants, and the Southern Pearl's kitchen was among the best equipped he'd ever seen. David Chen took a spoonful of his gumbo and his eyes widened. "This is incredible," he said, forgetting himself for a moment. "The depth of flavor is remarkable." Preston shot him a disapproving look. "Don't get too excited, David. It's just soup." He finally tasted his own appetizer, and despite himself, a flicker of surprise crossed his face before he could hide it. But he quickly recovered. "It's adequate. Though any decent chef could make this with their eyes closed." Michelle maintained her professional demeanor, but her regular customers could see the slight twinkle in her eye. They'd seen that look before. It usually meant something interesting was about to happen. "The wine you ordered will be here shortly," Michelle informed them. "Our cellar keeper is bringing up a special bottle." "Cellar keeper?" Preston scoffed. "You mean you actually have a wine cellar? In this neighborhood?" His tone suggested he found the very idea absurd. As they waited for the wine, Preston's complaints became increasingly petty. The bread was too fresh. Apparently, he preferred his bread with a harder crust. The butter was too cold. It didn't spread easily enough for his liking. The lighting was too atmospheric, though other diners found it perfect for lunch. A young server passed by with plates for another table, and Preston took the opportunity to demonstrate his expertise. "You see," he said to his associates, gesturing at the server, "that's exactly what I mean about proper training. The way she's carrying those plates, totally amateur. In my restaurants, we have strict standards." The server in question was actually using the exact technique taught in high-end restaurants, a detail that didn't escape the notice of other industry professionals dining in the restaurant that day. The wine arrived, presented by Robert with all the ceremony it deserved. It was a rare vintage that Michelle had acquired at auction, one of only a few hundred bottles produced. Robert began the presentation, but Preston waved him off. "I think I know how to handle a bottle of wine," Preston declared, reaching for it. "Though I doubt anything from this cellar would impress me. I have quite an extensive collection at home." As he examined the label, his eyebrows rose slightly. Even he couldn't hide his recognition of the prestigious vineyard and vintage. But he quickly masked his surprise with another criticism. "Storing this wine here seems almost criminal. I can't imagine you have the proper temperature controls." The reality was that Michelle had installed a state-of-the-art wine storage system that maintained perfect temperature and humidity levels. She'd spent months researching before choosing the system, ensuring their collection would be properly preserved. The tension in the dining room continued to build. Regular customers were now openly watching the scene unfold, some even declining to leave after finishing their meals. They knew Michelle, they knew her story, and they could sense that this situation was building towards something memorable. Preston swirled the wine in his glass with exaggerated expertise. "You can tell by the legs that it hasn't been stored properly," he declared, though the wine was showing beautifully. "In my restaurants, we would never serve wine in this condition." David Chen, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable, finally spoke up again. "Actually, William, I think it's showing quite well. The bouquet is exceptional." "You need to develop a more refined palate, David," Preston dismissed him. "This is exactly why I need to mentor you more closely in proper business dining etiquette." Michelle stood quietly through all of this, her posture perfect, her expression professional. To most observers, she appeared to be taking the abuse with remarkable grace. But those who knew her well could see the slight curl at the corner of her mouth, the same expression she'd worn years ago when she proved all the doubting bank managers wrong. The main courses arrived at Preston's table, each plate a work of art. The honey-glazed pork tenderloin was perfectly cooked, its surface gleaming with a golden brown crust. The shrimp and grits looked like they belonged on the cover of a food magazine, with the creamy grits forming a perfect bed for the succulent Gulf shrimp. Preston barely glanced at his plate before finding his next complaint. "This portion size is ridiculous," he announced, though the serving was generous by any standard. "In a proper restaurant, you'd get at least twice this amount." Michelle stepped forward smoothly. "I'd be happy to bring you an additional portion, sir, if you find it insufficient." "That's not the point," Preston snapped, his voice rising. Several nearby diners paused their conversations to watch. "The point is that this whole place is amateur hour. I've been in the restaurant business for years, and I can tell you this isn't how things are done in genuine fine dining establishments." One of his business associates, a quiet man named Richard who hadn't spoken much during the meal, finally cleared his throat. "The food looks excellent to me, William. Perhaps we should focus on our business discussion." But Preston was on a roll now. He cut into his pork with unnecessary force, as if expecting it to be tough. When it proved to be perfectly tender, he seemed almost disappointed. "Well, at least the meat is cooked properly," he muttered, clearly struggling to find fault with the food itself. The dining room had grown unusually quiet. Regular customers were exchanging knowing looks, some even taking out their phones discreetly. They'd seen that supple shift in Michelle's posture, the one that meant something interesting was about to happen. "I think," Preston announced, pushing his plate away despite having barely touched it, "it's time we spoke to whoever's in charge of this establishment. The service has been absolutely unacceptable." David Chen looked mortified. "William, I really don't think that's necessary. The service has been perfectly fine." No, Preston interrupted, his voice carrying across the restaurant. "I'm doing them a favor, really. They need to understand how a real restaurant should be run. The owner clearly has no experience in fine dining, probably some local who got lucky with a loan." Michelle's eyes flickered briefly to her grandmother's photograph on the wall. The strong woman in the image seemed to be smiling a little wider now. "Of course, sir. I'll get the owner right away." As she turned to leave, Preston called after her, "And bring the chef too. I have some suggestions about proper food preparation that might help this place become a real restaurant someday." Tom, watching from the kitchen window, couldn't help but grin. He'd been working with Michelle for 5 years and had seen her build this place from the ground up. He knew what was coming. Michelle walked calmly to her office, her steps measured and purposeful. Inside, she opened her wardrobe. She always kept a crisp chef's coat and business jacket ready, a habit from her early days, when she'd often switch roles multiple times during service. She took a moment to look in the mirror as she removed her server's apron. Her grandmother had always told her, "Baby, sometimes the best lesson is letting people realize their own mistakes." Today, that lesson would be particularly sweet. As she changed, she could hear Preston's voice carrying from the dining room, still lecturing his increasingly uncomfortable associates about proper restaurant management. "The problem with these neighborhood places," he was saying, "is that they don't understand the sophistication required for true fine dining." Michelle pulled on her chef's coat, the fabric crisp and white, her name and title embroidered in elegant script. "Michelle Anderson, executive chef and owner." She adjusted the collar, thinking about all the late nights, early mornings, and countless sacrifices that had gone into building the Southern Pearl. She picked up her portfolio, the one containing all the restaurant's awards, reviews, and recognitions. 5 years of accolades, including that glowing write-up in Food and Wine magazine that had called the Southern Pearl a masterclass in modern Southern cuisine. Before stepping out of her office, Michelle took one final moment to center herself. She thought about her grandmother, who had run her own restaurant in this very neighborhood during much harder times. She thought about all the young people she'd mentored, the community she'd built, and the legacy she was creating. A small smile played across her lips as she heard Preston's voice again, now demanding to know what was taking so long. The dining room had grown completely silent, like an audience waiting for the curtain to rise on the final act of a play. Every regular customer knew exactly what was about to happen, and not one of them was going to miss it. The dining room fell into an expectant hush as Michelle emerged from her office. She walked with quiet confidence, her chef's coat pristine, her portfolio tucked professionally under one arm. The regular customers tried to hide their smiles, some pretending to be deeply interested in their meals while watching the scene unfold from the corners of their eyes. Preston was in the middle of another complaint when she approached his table. Finally, he said without looking up, "I hope the owner is ready to hear some hard truths about running a proper restaurant." "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Michelle said, her voice clear and professional. "I'm Michelle Anderson, executive chef and owner of the Southern Pearl. I understand you wanted to speak with me." The silence that followed was deafening. Preston's fork clattered against his plate as he looked up, his face frozen in mid-complaint. His eyes darted from Michelle's face to her chef's coat, then to the portfolio in her hands, as his brain struggled to process what was happening. David Chen suddenly developed a coughing fit, possibly trying to cover a laugh. Richard, the quiet associate, was now sitting up straight, a look of deep interest on his face. The third associate seemed to be finding his water glass absolutely fascinating. "You?" Preston started, then stopped. For perhaps the first time in his business career, he appeared completely lost for words. Michelle opened her portfolio calmly. "I believe you had some concerns about our operation. I'd be happy to address them. But first, let me share some information about our restaurant." She laid out several articles and awards on the table. "This is our feature in Food and Wine magazine. Here's our write-up in Southern Living. And this," she pointed to a particularly prestigious certificate, "is our wine program's recognition from Wine Spectator." Preston's face had gone through several interesting color changes in the past few minutes. "But you were serving." "Yes," Michelle nodded. "I believe in knowing every aspect of my business. I often help serve during busy hours. It gives me a chance to connect with our guests and ensure we're maintaining the high standards we're known for." The other diners in the restaurant were now openly watching, some nodding in appreciation. A few regular customers were trying very hard not to break into applause. "That wine you just criticized," Michelle continued pleasantly, "I personally selected it at auction in Napa Valley last year. Our temperature-controlled wine cellar maintains perfect storage conditions. Would you like to see it? I designed it myself after studying wine preservation systems for months." David Chen was now looking at Michelle with undisguised admiration. "The food is absolutely spectacular," he said. "I can see why you've received so many accolades." Preston seemed to be shrinking in his chair. His earlier bravado had evaporated like morning dew in the Georgia sun. He opened his mouth several times, but no words came out. "As for our kitchen equipment," Michelle went on, her voice still perfectly pleasant, "we use top-of-the-line commercial-grade everything. I'd be happy to give you a tour. Our dishwashing system alone cost more than some people's cars." She gestured toward the walls, where photographs told the story of the neighborhood's history. "This restaurant represents generations of tradition and hard work. That lady there." She pointed to the photograph of her grandmother. "She ran a restaurant in this neighborhood during times when some people wouldn't even serve her. She taught me that success isn't about proving others wrong, it's about proving yourself right." The quiet associate, Richard, spoke up. "Ms. Anderson, your restaurant is remarkable. I've eaten at establishments all over the world, and this ranks among the best experiences I've had." Michelle smiled warmly. "Thank you. We strive to make every guest feel welcome." She emphasized the word every ever so slightly, her eyes meeting Preston's. Preston was now staring at his barely touched food, his face a mix of embarrassment and shock. The man who had been so quick to judge, so eager to demonstrate his supposed superiority, looked like he wanted nothing more than to disappear into his expensive leather chair. "Now," Michelle said, gathering her portfolio, "is there anything else you'd like to know about how a real restaurant should be run? I have quite a bit of experience in that area." Her tone was professional, but there was just the slightest trace of well-earned satisfaction in her voice.